Well, I guess it's recorded, so we can go ahead and get started. First off, thanks for joining. I'm David Gaines. I'm part of Advanced Computing Operations, and I have two co-hosts with me, both colleagues from ACO, Pamela and Haley, who will be helping steward questions and chat as we go along. So this is the NLR HPC FY27 allocation cycle. Part of my role is to help steward this for ACO. And really have two slides at the beginning, which are maybe the most critical slides to talk about. The first is the description of Kestrel, which is the supercomputer we'll be doing FY27 allocations on. It is the Critical Minerals and Energy Innovations Office third generation supercomputer. It's a heterogeneous system, meaning that compute capacity is roughly split between both CPU nodes, 2000-ish, 2314, and then 156 GPU nodes, which have 4 H100s each. Together, that adds up to roughly 56 petaflops of theoretical compute. And then again, on the right, it's a very, it's a heterogeneous system, but it's also a very diverse user base, project base, and high performance codes base. So there's a lot of different codes that are used within Kestrel. And as it's a computer dedicated to critical minerals and energy innovation research, it's also highly efficient, uses warm water cooling as well as waste heat recovery throughout the ESIF building as well as the kind of surrounding areas. And again, the second high-level slide is that allocations we made on Kestrel, as I said, it's a heterogeneous system, so it's designed with both CPU nodes and GPU nodes. There's really three key focus areas for FY27. The first one is differentiation between what you need for CPU side and what you need for GPU side. This is really a repeat from last year. This doesn't really affect how you use the computer. AUs are fungible. They can be used for both CPU or GPU jobs. It's really a request on our part to understand what people need for budgeting, for accounting, and then planning for future buy-ins or future HPC systems. The second kind of important bullet point here is that storage requests will receive additional scrutiny in FY27. It's in the second or third year of Kestrel. We're not really at capacity yet, but we are staring down that tunnel and seeing that boulder approach. So we want to kind of get ahead of the curve there and really pay additional attention to storage in FY27. So there will be quota enforcement as well as scratch purging policies in place for FY27. And then we will kind of review your storage requests kind of extensively. The final bullet point there for kind of key focus areas is this AI ML request that projects provide additional detail and workflow description. That includes Genesis mission projects. And we'll have some additional details on what we really want in some of the later slides. Finally, get your requests in early. If you don't have an HPC account already, request an account now to avoid delays. You should still submit a proposal if you're unsure of your funding status, which I'll repeat multiple times through this slide deck. The intent is for the allocation cycle to run in parallel to the funding cycle. And then finally, applications are due by June 11th. Please get your requests in as early as possible. So again, heterogeneous, meaning we have both CPU and GPU compute. GPUs do comprise a large percent of the computational capacity on Kestrel. So we really want to get separate requests both for CPU node hours and for GPU node hours. It doesn't affect what you can spend necessarily, but it's for us for planning, budgeting, and accounting purposes. AUs I defined on the next slide, but it's allocation units. The idea is that we want some common kind of baseline currency to compare systems. And so on Kestrel, one CPU node hour is 10 AUs, one GPU node hour is 100 AUs. Important caveat is that the GPU nodes are shareable, splittable. So you can use one GPU on the GPU node and be charged 25 AU, so basically the fractional amount of the node that you use. The next point here is that Kestrel is a fairly large system, so we may be able to consider projects that are not directly supported by CMEI or NLR. For those projects, we want a detailed CMEI mission impact statement, and we'll have more detail on that on the later slides. And then finally, technical readiness reviews. Again, we'll pay attention to what you request, as well as all the supporting documentation, abstracts, computational approach, storage justification, etc. All of that will be reviewed as part of this technical readiness review. And then please be responsive to the TRR team's questions. It's not their full-time job to do TRRs. And so anything we can do to reduce that burden is appreciated. As I said before, we define an AU, which is kind of a unit of compute that's scaled to be consistent between our systems. So an AU on Eagle is theoretically the same amount as compute as one AU on Kestrel. The difference is that one CPU node hour on Kestrel is 10 AUs, whereas Eagle, I believe it was 3 AUs. So hypothetically, a CPU node on Kestrel is roughly 3 times faster than Eagle. What's available for FY27? We have 320 million AUs across both the CPU and GPU side, roughly 191 million on CPU side, and then 129 million on the GPU side. And then 95 petabytes of storage, where I believe 61 petabytes is on projects, 30 petabytes for Scratch, and then the remainder is kind of aside for home and kind of shared software, the module stack. Resources are allocated 85% to CMEI, 15% to NLR projects. And this is because we operate Kestrel on behalf of CMEI, and that's how they end up with that 85%. Eligibility. There's really 2 buckets of eligibility. The first one is kind of NLR projects. So any NLR project, regardless of funding source, is eligible for an allocation, and this falls into that 15% bucket. The other tranche is the CMEI bucket, and that has really 2 ways to be granted a project in the CMEI bucket. One is if they're funded by CMEI at really any location, national lab, industry partners, universities, things like that. They would all be eligible for an allocation. And then the second kind of bucket for the CMEI 85% is mission impact projects. So they're aligned with the CMEI mission, but not directly funded by CMEI. They would also be eligible on a space available basis for an allocation in the CMEI side, and that would be approved and granted by CMEI. Who should apply? Projects should apply if they're funded, if they're thinking about a proposal, or they're planning a proposal. If you're at this meeting, most likely you should submit an allocation request. Again, the intent is for allocation cycle to be run in parallel to kind of the proposal or funding cycle. And then at the bottom, a reminder that it's one allocation per funded project, so we don't want to split projects into multiple allocations. Even if it's scattered across different labs, it should still be one single allocation. And then on the other hand, don't use umbrella allocations either to cover multiple projects. The real takeaway is one allocation per funded project. From a scheduling perspective, we're right now May 19th, so I guess we're 5 days into the allocation cycle. It started on May 14th, and we'll be accepting allocations till at least June 11th. During this time, between May and mid-July, we'll be doing all of the technical readiness reviews, internal reviews, as well as analysis of all the allocation requests. Sometime in mid to late July, we'll be sending all that information out to CMEI and NLR. And there'll be multiple working group and committee meetings between this July timeframe and mid-September, when we hope to have decisions in place from both CMEI and NLR. And then finally, activation on or before October 1st, with the notification of awards happening at the same time. As a reminder, NLR is not the decision maker for CMEI projects. Our role is just to provide the best information possible to them so that they can make those decisions. There's a separate process in place for NLR projects, and that's essentially handled by both CSC staff and LPMs and other interested members. And again, finally, I said it multiple times, but this is designed to be parallel to the funding process. You don't need to have a funded project to apply for the allocation. The expectation is that, if your project ends up not being funded or not selected, that you could release those AUs to be used by a separate project within your office or area. Again, updates and mid-year requests are possible, but it's on a space available process. Excuse me. So technical readiness review, it is what it sounds like. It's essentially a technical review of your proposal to ensure that it can run in our HPC system. It's not a value judgment on the research or anything like that. It's purely a technical review. I want to start at the bottom here because these bottom three components really feed into this top one, which is, what software will be used? Is the software available? Are the licenses available? Will it run on our HPC system? So it's kind of the basic check or basic question that we try to review. The second part is, feeding into the first part, the software. We try to validate both the size of the compute and the storage request justification, and that's a holistic review of the abstract, the project milestones, the project task, the software requested fields, as well as computational approach and the storage justification if necessary. And so we try to make sure that all of that aligns and all of that's tied together and makes sense holistically. The third one is the project ready if appropriate to use GPUs. Again, since 70% of our computational capacity is on the GPU side, we really want to understand, why people aren't using GPUs if not, or ensure that they're making the best use of Kestrel if they can use GPUs. So it's part of it's not a pass-fail check. It's just, is it possible for them to use GPUs? And if not, we're going to work with you to try to get you to use GPUs. And then finally, this is a project suitable for HPC. This is really the pass-fail part of the question. There's three categories: ideal, suitable, or unsuitable. Ideal is that Pythagorean theorem idea of like what HPC software is like. There's some examples here, but for the large part, there's quite a bit of work done that's in the suitable category, which is the single node to small multi-node jobs where they need to do high throughput work with hundreds of thousands of jobs. And it's just, HPC makes sense, but it's not like a pure HPC software application. And then unsuitable, that's kind of a rare category that's really kind of ties into what software they're requesting, or I can't think of examples right now, but if something is deemed unsuitable, that's not like an end state. That's typically like outreach and understand what you're trying to do, and then try to find the correct solution for you to do it, whether or not that's modifying the proposal so that it fits into the HPC environment, or finding a different resource for you. And again, we'll follow up with you if there's any issues. It's not a pass, fail, walk away. It's a find issues, try to resolve them, and kind of clean up the proposals. And then please provide timely responses to the review team, again, because it's something that they're doing on the side in most cases with researchers or subject matter experts, and so we'd appreciate timely responses. For submitting requests, we'll be using Lex. It's our software package that we use is developed in-house to handle the allocation process. There's several reminders here that, again, you should submit or apply for an allocation if your project's funded, proposals under consideration, or if you plan to submit one during FY26 with needs in FY27. If you're updating an allocation for what's your lead, there's an option to copy that information over as a starting point, and I'll talk about that in some later slides as well. Pilot forms. The pilot form is designed to streamline the process for folks. Pilots are smaller projects, so you can select either large or small. The small is something we added this year, and the intent, we can always grow small projects if necessary, but the goal is to get a better estimate of what people really plan to use. And if they really only need a small amount of AUs to complete their research, we wanted to give them that option, and it helps us from a budgeting and kind of accounting standpoint to fit more projects on the system and kind of manage that kind of expected node hours that might be running on the system on a quarterly basis. And then finally, student projects, students at US universities or colleges with mission-aligned computing needs should use the pilot form, and I'll have more kind of documentation about that in some later slides. And then again, a reminder that we simplified the forms by integrating the software requests and AU calculator, which will make it easier for you to estimate how many AUs you need for your project. But that tool is essentially an accessory tool. We want you to still document what you plan to do in the computational approach, and I'll cover that in later slides as well. So how to submit requests for computing. The first thing is to log on. The link is hpcprojects.nlr.gov to prepare your submission. You'll log on using an NLR HPC username and password. There's no token required. And then HPC projects at nlr.gov should be visible to both internal and external users. So if you're unable to log in, there are links on this page to both reset your password or to contact us to request assistance. And then finally, if you don't have an HPC account, there's also a link here on this page to request the account, but you can also go to our HPC homepage to find the account request button. So once you've logged on, you can submit an FY27 allocation request. You can use the FY26 button if you need a pilot right now to test code. So that might make sense for some of you that are requesting a new project for FY27 and you want to hit the ground running. You technically would be eligible to submit a pilot request now in FY26 to get prepared for FY27. The other options are to create a new FY27 allocation request, which you would select this blue button here that I've highlighted in red. And then the third option is to update an FY26 allocation for which you are the lead. So you can use the copy to FY27 button down here at the bottom. You might not see the orange bar. That's because it's from the dev environment, but you still should see this copy to FY27. Excuse me. So once you've created the new FY27 allocation request or copied FY27, at the top of the screen, you'll see the request type fields. Standard request is anything that's not a pilot, so anything that's greater than 150,000 AUs. The pilot request is a simplified form, and it's designed for smaller projects to gain HPC experience or develop code in preparation for a future allocation. And then finally, there's also the student request. Again, students, any undergraduate or graduate students from any US college or university with HPC needs or research needs that are aligned with the CMEI mission are eligible for student requests. And we've had, upwards of 30 to 40 for the past couple of years each year. So I've already said this first bullet point, request a pilot that's less than or equal to 150K AUs. We can grant pilots at any time throughout the year. And as I said before, it streamlines and simplifies the allocation request form. And then finally, the resources for pilots default to 150K or 50K AUs. Select the smaller if that's truly what you need. There's no downside. If you do need to expand your project later, we can work with you to scale up that pilot if necessary. But it does help us from a budgeting and planning perspective. And then finally, it defaults to 10 terabytes of storage. So the next thing you will see for your Lex allocation is the request information. Maybe starting here, one of the most important things to highlight is that you can use these info buttons for more information on any one of these fields. And then also anything in gray is auto-populated. White would be something you would enter manually. So repeating or starting back from the left-hand side, first off for the handle, replace the default, avoid using the year, your name, or HPC in the handle. Some type of noun, verb, something that describes what your project is doing. So for example, I have an example allocation management project, and I call it manage. The next field to fill out would be title. It should match what your funding proposed title would be. And of course, in this case, mine is allocation management for Kestrel HPC. Short abstract should be, less than or equal to 35 words. It's a 1 or 2 sentence description of what you're doing and how you plan to use HPC. The abstract would be the longer abstract that you'd be used to from journal articles or things like that. The focus areas down here, there's essentially 6 options. We use these for categorizing the HPC usage. If you don't align with any of these pre-selected focus areas, you can select other, but then you will be required to enter something into this explanation box just to have us better understand what you're doing. Newer continuing project, if you use the copy to functionality, it should default to continuing. But in this context, it's not only if it's a new allocation on Kestrel, if you were doing this project work on NERSC or some other HPC center in previous years, you would still mark this as a continuing project because it's continuing. It might be new to Kestrel or new to NLR, but we still want to know that this project is carryover work from some other data center. For new or existing workflow, in this case, we're asking, is this stuff you've done before? Is this a standard type of simulation or modeling exercise that you know how to do and you've done this before? It would be existing. If it's a totally new workflow that you may or may not need help on or that you need to develop code for, it would be a new workflow. The expected duration of projects, in all cases, we do a yearly award cycle. So in all cases, these awards are for the upcoming fiscal year, but we do want to track or understand what projects might continue into future fiscal years. And so that's what we're asking in this case. I believe the options are only for this year or for 2 years or for multiple years into the future. Then finally, on the right-hand side for keywords, use keywords similar to what you might use for a journal article. We really use this for basically searching through projects and tagging projects with different attributes. So it's helpful for us if you add in some keywords that describe what your project is doing. The next thing you'll see on the form is the contact information. So we really want at least 2 people listed on the on the allocation, so that we have some type of backup. So we state here that lead, alternate, and PI are required. In some instance where maybe I was the PI, I could also be the lead, but I would need someone else listed for the alternate position. So we want at least 2 people listed on these contacts lists. And for the most part, the lead and the alternate are the ones that will contact for any HPC issues. So adding or removing people to the allocation, or if we have questions about storage or quota, things like that, we'll talk to the lead or alternate. The PI typically is contacted for reporting reasons. They may be contacted for CMEI program reasons, maybe during the yearly or annual report or recap report, we would contact the PI in those types of instances. But they're not really contacted for day-to-day tasks. And they're technically not required to have an HPC account, but there's no reason not to. So funding information and project goals would be the next part of the allocation request form. So I'll start off with technology area, and we call these technology areas, they're really a list of all of the CMEI offices and then a few additional options. And what we're asking you is to choose which area your research best aligns with. It has no implication about funding at this point. We really just want to know what area your research is aligned with. The next box to the right, the funding source, does have implications for funding. And in that case, the options are CMEI, NLR, various DOE offices like Office of Science, ARPA-E. And then there also is an other selection if we haven't selected your specific funding source. If you do select other for funding source, you are required to add some additional detail in this funding source details box. And we do appreciate it because it does help us track things down a bit more. Project type, there's 5 or 6 options like NOFO, CRADA, LDRD, AOP. There might be an other in there as well. But again, select either what applies to your project or add some additional detail in this details box to the right. We do have a Genesis mission or Genesis option and funding source, and please select Genesis if your project proposal is funded under the Genesis mission. If your funding there's really 2 options for funding status, either funded or requested. If you are funded, enter funded and then the end date. If you haven't received funding notification yet, put requested. You can leave end date blank, and we may follow up with you at a later date to understand what your funding status is when the allocation cycle starts. For DOE federal contact, we really do want those. Makes a lot of sense for a lot of the CMEI offices and DOE offices. So we'll follow up with you if this is left blank. We need someone to contact or someone to follow up with on your project during the allocation process. So please do your best to enter into federal contact if you can. For the mission impact statement, we really want all projects to include an impact statement to show how this project is aligned or impacts the CMEI mission. Again, it should be kind of a high-level abstract that describes how your project is related to CMEI and how it impacts the CMEI mission. And then finally, for program, task, milestones, and most critical milestone, just let us know how HPC fits into the overall program and describe in as much detail as possible how you will use HPC for specific tasks or milestones. So this is the computational resources and software requested calculator. The top part of it is a high-level description of the Kestrel node architecture for both the CPU side and GPU side. And then the top is some reminders and instructions for how to complete the allocation process. I do want to highlight this part here that might be hard to read, but later on we'll ask you to fill out a computational approach. The software requested kind of calculator here is not a replacement for a strong computational approach. They're really kind of accessory or an addendum. So even if you do complete this calculator, we still want a strong and detailed computational approach that describes what you're doing and how you're doing it. Yeah. So now I'll talk about the bottom part, which is the software request part. Really ask that you fill out anything in white here. The gray is auto calculated or auto filled. The first one is just the name of the software you're using, what the code source is, proprietary, commercial, open source DOE, open source non-DOE, things like that. And it'll be a toggle box. For MPI OpenMP, we're asking about the parallelism of your code. And then I'm going to skip to the bottom to the GPU part. And again, what we're asking here is, can your code run on GPUs? What would be the level of effort to make your code run on GPUs? And then what's the expected improvement for using GPUs? The next part I'll talk about is here in the middle, where I talk about both CPU runs and GPU runs. What you can see here is I've selected VASP. I expect to run 10,000 runs of VASP with 4-hour runtime using half a CPU node. And that calculates out to 20,000 node hours or 200,000 AUs. And then in the same form or same part of the software field, I've also filled out the GPU part because I expect to maybe run some of my runs using CPU and some via GPUs. And again, it auto calculates what the GPU node hours is, 2,500, and then the expected AU costs are 250,000. And then if I have a second software package I'm using, I can click this add button and then repeat this process. A common question might be, well, I might run VASP or I might run software A, but I might do 1,000 runs of it with a single node with an expected runtime of 4 hours per run, and then I might run a separate suite of runs with a completely different kind of parameterization. And so how do I accommodate that into a single software request? And the answer is kind of to do the best you can. If they're to basically the average of the two. And the goal here is to, estimate what node hours you might need for the VAST software, not to get the exact runtime and number of runs expected exactly precise here. It's really to get the estimated node hours and CPU AUs that you need for the VAST software. That level of detail where you actually have multiple suite of runs with different runtime or different parameterizations, include that in the computational approach, which kind of goes back to this statement here that this is kind of an accessory to the computational approach. And there may be questions about that. If there is, we can talk about them at the end, or I'm happy to work with you in HPC requests at nlr.gov at a later date. So once you've completed your software request, and in this case, I only have a single software listed, but in your case, you might have multiple software listed. Once you've completed all this, there is a total down here at the bottom where all of these AUs for both the CPU side and GPU side are summed together to create a total AU request, and then also explicitly listing just the CPU part and GPU part. Again, anything in gray is auto-populated, whereas white would be kind of filled in by you as the requester. So the next thing you would fill out is the storage request. If it's greater than 10 terabytes, we will ask you to provide a detailed justification. And as I said before, that will be a focus area for FY27. And so we'll follow up with you if we need to. The next thing to select here is the use pattern, which describes how you will work throughout the year, and I have details on the next slide. But the high level takeaway is that, we distribute your allocation on a quarterly basis. And so this describes how that allocation is split up across the quarters. And then finally, here at the bottom, we have the min and max total and implication. So the ask here is that you might be requesting a total of 450,000 AUs, but there may be some number below that, which you could still accomplish your milestones with little margin for error. And so we'd ask you to put in that number there, that whatever that number may be, as well as the implication of how your research might change if you if you had less AUs available. And then in a similar vein, we ask what you could do if you provided more AUs. If the system's undersubscribed and we have capacity to provide additional AUs, we may want to look through projects and see what's the implication of providing an additional 10%, 20%, 30% to a project. So in this case, we've written down that, with 750K AUs, we may be able to do like larger simulation data sets or higher fidelity results, so maybe to higher frequency, something along those lines. So usage pattern, again, usage pattern is selected here. There's roughly 5 options. You can either distribute equally across 4 quarters with a 25% in each quarter. You can do development in Q1 and production in Q2, and that alters how those AUs are allocated on a quarterly basis. You can also just avoid doing any work in Q1 and start in Q2. Maybe there's going to be a late start due to postdocs arriving at a certain time or something along those lines. And then finally, if you know that you're only going to be using AUs in the first half or second half of the fiscal year, you can also select those options. The goal here is really to match your plan to what your expected usage is. And since we use a fair share priority system, the better your usage matches to what you're allocated, the better your priority will be. And then correspondingly, less likely you will be to lose unused AUs. AUs are a unit of time. It's like a reservation at a restaurant. If you don't make it on that day, we can't guarantee that we have space the next day. And so it's just a function of time that as the days pass, we have less and less compute moving forward, at least for that fiscal year. And then more details on the code source and other things that I mentioned earlier. So for code source, we're asking if it's an internal, proprietary, open source, or if it's NLR, DOE, or commercial code. If you don't know, we may be able to help, but also, just should be able to do some research to understand where your code's coming from. And then for MPI and OpenMP, it's really a question about the parallelization of your code base. GPU readiness, can it run currently on GPUs? I believe that's a yes, no, or unknown option. For GPU effort, if you have any control whatsoever, how hard is it to move it over to GPUs? If it's a commercial code, you can choose impossible. If it already runs on GPUs, then it's 0 or low. And then the expected performance improvement. And you may not know that precisely, but that might be a good reason for a pilot allocation prior to an FY27 allocation to kind of do that exploratory early investigation. So computational readiness part 1. There's a lot of information requested as part of the computational readiness. The first thing you'll see is let us know if your project supports ML AI. So it could be that you only, you're a consumer or use ML AI products. It could be that you're generating data sets or that you're developing new methods or algorithms. Once you select any one of these boxes, we do require you to enter this AI ML explanation. And if you select this information tooltip box, it'll pop up, It'll pop up some help text as well as an example. I don't have the example shown here, but the request is for you to include the role of AI ML in your project, how it advances your objectives or research objectives, what methods and models you're using, how you're doing training or inference or optimization, etc. We want to know about your compute usage. We want to know where you plan to for those activities to take place, and include like how Kestrel will be used relative to other DOE data centers, as well as external cloud or other compute resources. Also, deployment, if you plan to deploy it, how you plan to do so, or how you plan to integrate it into HPC workflows, whether or not you're going to be developing an API and hosting it on some type of cloud environment or what have you. We just really want to know as much detail as possible of how you plan to use AI ML. And then Genesis mission, if applicable, identify the national challenge you're addressing, as well as how this work contributes to that challenge and how Kestrel and other DOE kind of compute resources are used. So we really are, this is one of the focus areas for FY27. So we will kind of review this extensively. So please do your best to follow this numbered list. The second part here is the DAV nodes. So DAV nodes are data analysis and visualization nodes. Everybody's eligible to use them. We really just want to know who plans to and what they plan to do with them. Really, from a budgeting and accounting standpoint, and understand, it's a limited resource. We just want to make sure that we understand who's using them and, plan for the future if necessary. Computational readiness part 2. So again, computational approaches up to the top should really be a high-level HPC-centric abstract, as well as interleaved within that abstract your estimated experiments and simulations and estimated node hour AU kind of calculations per experiment. Larger requests and student requests will need a detailed computational approach. Smaller projects or people that are, maybe pilots, there's maybe a little bit more leeway or ambiguity there. But really, for any larger or student projects, we're going to heavily review these to kind of make sure everything aligns holistically. I/O and storage. I/O is really, do you expect to move large amount of data in and out of Kestrel? Is your code base you need high-speed parallel file system? Do you plan to use Globus to transfer data from point A to point B? Things like that. The storage request is required for anything that's greater than 10 terabytes. So we want you to explain the size of your request, including a detailed breakout describing the files, sizes, as well as the justification for storage. And like I said, we're not at capacity yet, but Kestrel's been around for 2 to 3 years at this point. So there will be additional scrutiny on storage, and we will reach back out to you if necessary. And then finally, other computational resources, just list any other HPC or cloud resources you have access to in FY27. We don't need to know about desktop computing necessarily, but if you're working with leadership class facilities or other kind of large data centers, we would like to know about it. Reminder again about storage. There's 2 main file systems on Kestrel, /projects and /scratch. Projects is 61 petabytes of storage intended for annual project data storage, so files needed for the life of the project. Intermediate data products should be routinely cleaned and really shouldn't be part of your storage request other than some buffer that's needed to accommodate like those intermediate products before you clean them. Scratch is intended for intensive I/O, so the recommendation is really to stage jobs in Scratch and move data products to projects as necessary. And then finally, please request what you need for storage. If it's less than 10 terabytes, let us know. If it's greater, please provide a detailed justification. And then just a reminder that there will be additional scrutiny on these requests for FY27. and we will be actively managing the file system in FY27, which includes quota enforcement, as well as semi-regular purging of scratch according to policy. Here I have kind of some brief reminders on student requests. So any student from US college or university can apply for these, apply for an allocation. For the technology area, please select the office that best aligns with your research. And then for funding source, CMEI, project type other, and then enter student project in the details. Your funding status will be requested in this case because we're requesting the allocation from CMEI. Leave federal contact is not applicable, and then include a detailed CMEI mission impact statement. So student requests are not limited to 150K AUs, even though they use the pilot size, but they do require a detailed accounting of the AU requests. So I'm going to skip over the AI/ML. This is identical to what I've said before, but when you do your computational approach, enter in the full kind of HPC centric abstract that details what you're running, what you'll need, and then have a total at the bottom, and we will essentially ensure that we update those things before we send them to CMEI, but we still want you to use the pilot form just for simplicity's sake. Submitting requests, you can save as many times as you want, but submit only once. If your project is a pilot, please use the pilot form. If you're a student, please use the student form. After submission, we'll do an initial review to make sure everything is complete and makes sense in a holistic way. At that point, we'll send it for technical readiness review. If you're asked questions, please respond as quickly as possible. Again, it's not anybody's full-time job to do these technical readiness reviews. We're asking researchers and subject matter experts to make time to do this. So we definitely appreciate responding in a prompt way. If you need any help or if you need changes, email HPC request. I steward that email and I'll do my best to either get you the help you need or to update the request if needed, and then work with CMEI if I need to update it at that level as well. Decisions will be communicated by October 1st, 2026. Historically, we've kind of known late September, so the decision might not be known until really right before that October 1st deadline. If you don't receive an allocation, you can still request a pilot. And finally, there's very little room for making mid-year changes. If you don't think you can complete what you plan to do with your allocation, talk to your project sponsor or federal contact. If the scope of your project changes, we could always work with you via HPC request, but it's just at some level, it's kind of a space available thing, and there might not be space available unless we can work with the project sponsor to move AUs between projects. Mid-year changes, again, pilots at any time. Larger requests, it's on a space available basis, just kind of dependent on what's available in the machine. If you need to make changes, email HPC requests at nlr.gov. I will steward that email. If your project does not get funded and you don't need the AUs, let us know. We can then release those for other projects. Or if your project has changed and you need fewer or more AUs, again, let us know and we can try to work with either CMEI or NLR to try to find more AUs if possible. Closing comments. Get an account now. That's really kind of step one. Submit your requests early and ask questions. You can email HPC request at nlr.gov if you have questions. Provide the best information possible up front. We'll definitely do the review and work with you to improve the request if necessary, but it is less stress and anxiety for everybody if we just kind of get things filled out in the best way up front. And then finally, just a reminder to provide the best possible data, how HPC usage fits into your milestones, fits into your research. It'll help us plan the most effective use of the machine. This final link is really, or final slide is just links. The first one is the Lex allocation system. The next one is the allocation call, and then I won't belabor the other links. This webinar and recording will eventually be posted to this second link here. And if you don't remember this link, what you can do is search for NLR HPC, and we should be one of the top hits within your favorite search engine. And I guess I'll stop now and ask if there's any questions. I think we do have some time for Q&A. I tried to speed up a little bit near the end. Looks like we have about 9 minutes. Pamela or Haley, were there any questions during the webinar that we can address?
There were
a few questions in the Q&A.
And we answered them, but we could mention what they were in case it's helpful to the general group.
Yeah.
I can take mine, Haley, and if you want to. Okay. And we answered this publicly also. Yes, slides will be made available. David just mentioned where they would be posted. And the next question was, will the funding resource allocation affect HPC allocation decisions? I answered not typically, but the fit needs to be within the scope of the CMEI mission, which is described in the presentation. Someone asked, what is CMEI? And if you were familiar with the organization abbreviated as EERE, which was the decision-making entity prior to December 1, 2025, that changed as we migrated into NLR from NREL, and the organization's CMEI is the Office of Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation. Next one is yours.
Yeah, then there were a couple about eligibility, which projects that are within the scope of the CMEI mission are eligible to apply. And a question about the student request. Correct me if I'm wrong, David, but they asked if it requires a PI. And so there is a box for the PI contact, but that can be someone who can speak to your project that's from the institution, that shouldn't be a student. So that could be like a professor or a mentor. And you'll need to put their email there.
Yeah, so the PI for the student request should really be the advisor or professor. There's been one case where the advisor PI for a student project worked at one of the national labs, and so I think the student was at Berkeley. So in a situation like that, it's definitely workable. But yeah, the intent is that the PI is some mentor, advisor, professor kind of role.
Yeah, and then there is a question about the emails. So it is required that the emails entered for the project leads and PIs are not free email domains, so not like Gmail or Hotmail that you can just get online. So they need to be institutional emails. And then the computational approach is limited to 5,000 characters. If we end up needing more detail on something, the reviewer will reach out to you.
Yes, and I did add to that, do follow the suggested content in the slides rather than just pasting a huge amount of information in from, say, a proposal. Just make sure you follow the approach David described in the slides. And also, each section should prompt you to any limits.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, both of you.